Viewers and listeners, welcome to yet another episode of The Conversation. Today I'm excited to have Bernard Matolino, an associate professor in philosophy at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Professor Bernard Matolino, welcome to The Conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
Wonderful. Today we are set to discuss your book, Consensus as Democracy in Africa, and I believe it was an outstanding publication that deserves to have a talk on platforms like this. So first and foremost, how is work and your family, and how is the COVID-19 situation in South Africa?
Well, work is going well, I suppose, as well as it can be under the current circumstances. We're mainly working from home. We're delivering lectures online. My family is well, thank you for asking. I hope yours is well too. Well, the COVID situation from government communication is slightly improved. I think the infection rates have gone down, the death rate has gone down. The economy is now mostly open with restrictions, of course, but I think it's much better than it was in March right now.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. It's exciting that things are getting better. The reports that have been coming out from the mainstream media in the previous weeks have not been pleasant, but I'm happy to know that things are getting to be a bit better. So can you give us a brief description of your academic journey that then gets us to this publication? When did you start to research this book, and how did you go about doing the research?
Well, as you correctly pointed out, I'm a philosopher, or would like to believe that I'm one at least. I did my undergraduate studies in philosophy and law, and then decided, no, law is not for me. Then went on to do philosophy, maybe because in philosophy, you're not required to read as much as you are with law. So I did my graduate work in philosophy, and when I was about to start my PhD, I asked my then supervisor what appropriate topic I should undertake research on. I had wanted to do research on the philosophy of science. I've been fascinated by courses I'd taken as an undergraduate in philosophy of science, but my supervisor was not too keen on that. So I dropped that idea. And then I started thinking about being an African, what it meant to be a philosopher as an African. And I started reading and researching on African stuff. So that's how my journey as an African philosopher started. It started off with a bit of curiosity, but also quite a great deal of doubt about what this whole enterprise was about, and whether it was even possible to talk about African philosophy, which are questions that are easily reflected in the beginnings of African philosophy. But when we come to this book, my PhD was on personhood and political philosophy, particularly African socialism. So I was interested in how personhood and African socialism kind of offered each other support for their viability. But as I was doing my PhD, which I started in 2005 and completed in 2008, as I was doing my PhD, I started coming across some claims that were being made on behalf of African conceptualizations of democracy that were not of a socialist streak. And those claims were mainly of a consensual type.
Mm-hmm.
And the primary claim around these claims was the superiority of African consensual democracy to its counterpart, majoritarian democracy.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, majoritarian democracy was imposed on the continent by our former colonial administrators.
Mm-hmm.
When they were done with their colonial project, they decided we should be majoritarian. So that's how I came to consensus. And I started reading more and more about it. And then the whole book took me 13 years to research on, think through, and write.
That was long. Yeah, that was long.
But it's also funny how time flies. You know,
Exactly.
it's yeah. So it really took me about 13 years because this subject was always very close to me, even if it was not so central in my PhD. It was something that was very close to me. I think my second academic published paper was on consensus. So what happened to me was, I suppose, first, it was an exuberant discovery. And the journey I undertook was characterized by a lot of positive expectation of the viability of consensus as a theoretical model that could rival, if not even outdo, majoritarian democracy.
Mm-hmm.
However, as years went by, I became dissatisfied with consensus as a model of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And this book is probably a reflection of that dissatisfaction.
Mm-hmm. 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 Oh, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I see. That's excellent. It's an excellent experience, and I like that your decision to settle to write this book is informed by a background of an education, a careful study of events, and a careful study of what was actually going around. But let me just ask you about the research and about the financial support that you've indicated that you received some substantial support from the AHP for the publication and for the research of the book. What can you just briefly tell us what does AHP do, and how can a potential academic interested in research receive support from it?
So AHP stands for the African Humanities Program. They are based in the United States of America, and they are mainly sponsored or supported, from what I understand, by the American Council of Learned Societies.
Mm-hmm.
Operate in 5 countries. I just can't remember the 5th country, but they are in Ghana, Nigeria, Tanzania, and South Africa. So they award PhD scholarships as well as early career postdoc funding to deserving candidates to write books in humanities. So they send out adverts every year, I think, and then you apply. If you're successful, you are awarded a certain amount of money that's meant either for teaching relief or for research support for you to complete a monograph on an approved topics. It's you who chooses the topic, basically, and then you submit that topic to them. Then it goes through a number of evaluative stages until it's finally approved. It's quite a rigorous process, right from the beginning up to the end. But the gratitude I really express is that, as you know, research costs money, and in Africa we are hard pressed to find money just lying around for people to carry out, let's say, maybe not so practical research, such as theoretic models of democracy. There are more pressing issues that the money can be used for, like building bridges or building clinics or getting rid of mosquitoes and associated diseases, not just to think wildly about what form of democracy is appropriate to the continent. So I'm really grateful, and I'm sure all other AHP awardees are really grateful for the support we received, which enabled us to undertake projects of our choice and complete these projects. I don't think this book would have seen the light of day without the support of the AHP.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, wonderful, wonderful. I believe that they are doing a very good job. You raise a very important point that in Africa, back home in Africa, we do have other terribly pressing concerns such that it's very difficult for our governments and for other organizations to channel money to researches of books, because we do really have other pressing concerns: infrastructural development, health delivery, and so forth. Well, this book, Professor Bernard Matolino, it received quite some impressive reviews and lofty praise from the academic community. I was going through some reviews and I came across a review that was written by Professor Andrew Nash from the Department of Political Science at the University of Cape Town. And he wrote the following about consensus is democracy. He wrote that it's both an inquiry into the conceptual meaning and coherence of the claims made for consensual democracy, a reflection on the ways in which the pre-colonial past informs the political choices faced by the African continent. I'm sure that this was exciting and profound to receive.
No, absolutely. And I think it's a correct characterization of the book.
Mm-hmm.
The book is caught up, as much as the subject matter itself is caught up in this whirlwind, we may say, that Africa finds itself in.
Mm-hmm.
The tension of an Africa that is transforming from its traditional ethos
mm-hmm.
into the modern world. I do not think that the transition has been quite complete. Mm-hmm. And I think that the journey was started on the right foot. There are many aspects of Africa that remain traditional, and either by force or by resurrection, mm-hmm. try to impose themselves on the reality of an Africa that is attempting to modernize. Mm-hmm. And a part of it includes the subject matter of the book, democracy. Mm-hmm. Democracy is, of course, a modern project that we must accept. Mm-hmm. Even in Europe and in other parts of the world which are now seen as mature democracies, democracy was not always the case. We can talk about the Greek antecedent of democracy, but Plato, one of the most famous philosophers, was anti-democracy. Exactly. Democracy had sort of to fight for itself, even in Greece itself, and kind of pop up as an acceptable mode of governance. Europe has a long history of nasty dictatorship until the ordinary people seize power. In some instances, quite literally.
Exactly.
And,
exactly.
Yeah. So even the development of the House of Commons, it's not like the House of Commons was always there. It's the common people, you know. They were not people who really mattered. The House was for the Lords. So democracy is if we want to really think about democracy, we're thinking about what modernity has bequeathed to us, mm-hmm. in terms of how we can govern ourselves. Mm-hmm. With Africa, and here I rely mainly on Olufemi Taiwo. It's not really an original thought, but I don't discuss it in the book. But Olufemi Taiwo, who's based at Cornell, has got an interesting book, How Colonialism Preempted Modernity in Africa. Mm-hmm. What is instructive with Taiwo's discussion is that modernity in Africa was introduced and cemented by the colonial experiment. Mm-hmm. And the colonial experiment did not seek to modernize Africa. It sought actually to exploit Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And when the colonial experiment was done and this time was up, what it left behind was not real modernity. It was rather facets of modernity that were going to lay foundation for a contradictory state or ongoing African experiment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Modernity should overcome. And many of us have got difficulty in accepting that. Modernity should overcome. It's as simple as that. Modernity should overcome whatever it is fighting. If it is fighting traditionalism, if it is fighting a certain view of life that is not consistent with its own understanding of how things should be arranged, modernity should overcome. In Africa, modernity never quite overcame because it was never meant to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why maybe we've got serious problems about democracy.
Yeah, yeah.
Democracy proceeds from modernity, and modernity never really overcame anything or serious stuff in Africa. Then democracy doesn't stand a chance as much as modernity also doesn't quite stand a chance. Mm-hmm. Now, the trouble I had in going through all the stuff I did, mm-hmm. that was in support of consensus, was how tradition was being invoked either as a justification for the way that life should be or as a superior model of interpreting democracy. Mm-hmm. So there is this commitment to a traditional view of Africa that seeks to suggest that traditional stuff or stuff that is traditional and African mm-hmm. enjoys greater viability than other stuff that we experience as Africans. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the starting point, for example, that Kwasi Wiredu, who is the prominent figure in consensus and also happens to be the most prominent, let's say, modern African philosopher. So you see, nobody doubts that Kwasi Wiredu is a talented philosopher. Nobody doubts that mm-hmm. Kwasi Wiredu is an important founding figure in African philosophy. Mm-hmm. But Kwasi Wiredu also presents a very interesting commitment, both to modern philosophy and to traditional views. He is in full support of a philosophy that should be modern, analytical, rigorous, that should get rid of African voodooistic commitments, if you want. Mm. But at the same time, Kwasi Wiredu is also seriously committed to ideas that he thinks originate from our traditional wealth. Mm-hmm. Ideas he thinks can be useful or can prove relevant, if not even superior to some of the ideas that modernity has given birth to. And for our purposes, the idea that he is absolutely committed to is the idea of consensual democracy, or what he calls democracy is consensus, or consensus is democracy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is where this idea originates from. Wiredu is very explicit. Mm-hmm. He says, if anyone were to come to Africa and were to try to preach to us that we do not know what democracy is, or if anybody was to try to say to us, we are not democratic enough, at least amongst the Akans of Ghana, that person will be laughed out of court. Why? Because the Akans have got a very clear idea of what democracy is. Mm-hmm. And their idea of democracy was always with them. So it's a traditionalistic idea of democracy. So it's a traditional idea of democracy that is found amongst the Akans. Now, we know a certain idea of democracy as majoritarian. Mm-hmm. But Wiredu is thoroughly dissatisfied with this idea of democracy, which is majoritarian. There are certain elements of this democratic system, the majoritarian type, that are faulty, and Wiredu points them out. I will refer to two as he points them out. The first one has got to do with the attitude that he calls the winner takes all mentality.
Mm-hmm.
So if we are up for elections, like the Americans are going to do in about a month's time or so,
yeah,
there is not going to be any compromise. It's either Biden or Trump.
mm-hmm.
The same applies to the British, and that's the story with all so-called mature democracies. Now, what happens with such a situation is that it fosters a hardening of attitudes between the winners and the losers. Whatever the outcome may be, the winners and the losers have got no grounds to find reconciliation, either for the good of the community, the country, or whatever political space they occupy. In Africa, we have seen many episodes play themselves out where hardened attitudes along lines of winners and losers have led to the loss of limb and life, as Wiredu calls it.
Exactly, exactly.
Politically, life is cheapened along the lines of who is winning and who is losing.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea of winner and loser not only creates disaffection, but it also has potential to create extensive violence. And Africa has been a perfect playground for this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
This type of politics just doesn't serve Africa well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well. I'm happy that we are getting to start this discussion. Professor Bernard, first of all, let me just say, can you give us a brief synopsis of your book and what you consider to be its central argument?
Before I go to the central argument, let me briefly refer to the second point that Wiredu talks of as appealing, the justification of consensual democracy. Is majoritarian democracy only emphasizes on representation, formal representation to be precise, whereas consensual democracy emphasizes what he calls substantive representation. And again, this is gleaned from traditional Akan society. Not only was the representative formally present at decision-making councils, but the representative also took the word of his constituency to the council. Now, coming to your question. There are two things about this book that I think are key to democracy. The first is the definition of democracy itself. And the second is the viability of consensus as a superior mode of democracy. When we try to define democracy, what exactly are we talking about? That is the major worry that this book tries to carry through in its investigation. Our attempts at defining democracy, from what I could gather, remember this book is very specific to a field, and the field is African political theory. In African political theory, the definition of democracy has been reduced to the function of representation, just from my literature side. So when we talk about democracy, we are talking about how is it able to satisfy representation, particularly of the substantive sort that Wiredu talks about. For Wiredu's major dissatisfaction is that if you look at democratic systems in the world, most cases consider it adequate that there is only formal representation, that they are actual members of parliament, be they people from particular constituencies or people from unknown constituencies, but that they are just there is enough and that they've been elected. For Wiredu, that's not the case. The real definition of democracy spins around the substantive element, that the people's will is sufficiently represented, that what the people want is given adequate voice and attention and representative bodies. The second point that this book tries to look at is what we could probably call the nature or the function of democracy. What is it that democracy is supposed to do? Be it as consensual democracy or as majoritarian democracy, because remember our first concern is the definition of democracy. But when we are done defining democracy, or when we are done failing to define democracy, what is our next move? Are we going to ditch the whole project, or we could embark on a more useful exercise? And that exercise will be the function of democracy. There are many things that can be said in that respect. And those things have got to do with how we understand basically the relationship that should exist between the state and its subjects, how the subjectivity of those subjects feature in decision-making and processes that are supposed to be reflective of that relationship between the state and its subjects. But over and above political issues, what do we think is the appropriate task of democracy? What is democracy supposed to do in our societies? When we define our societies as democratic, in what ways do these societies function much better than those societies that are non-democratic? Mm-hmm. And if we look at the different types of democracy that we have, which type of democracy tends to satisfy democratic requirements of a non-political nature better than other types of democracy? And that part of the book, I think, seeks then to secure an answer to the first question, because democracy is not just a theoretical discussion. It is also a very practical thing. Living in a fully flourishing democratic state is completely different from living in a dictatorship or an authoritarian system. So what is it about democracy that it does for us that we think is so worthwhile that we have to defend the idea of democracy itself?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so those were the major concerns.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, wonderful. I see.
Not very directly. I mean, we go through some parts and
yeah, I see. Well, thank you very much for that response. Thank you very much. Your book, Professor Bernard Matolino, it challenges conventional interpretations on Africa, that the interpretations that have been made by some philosophers, especially the argument that consensus as a polity provides the best chance for Africa to democratize. What would you say are some of the typical examples that you use to justify your argument?
Well, I do not have any. I do not have any example per se, because as a philosopher and like a political scientist, I'm not interested in particular, as a political theorist, I'm not really interested in particular instances of either countries or regions on the continent where democracy is felt. So I keep it pretty abstract, but it's not really difficult to see where my idea of challenging this belief that consensus is a superior polity, or that consensus as a polity holds so much promise for for the continent. There are a number of, I won't call them flaws, that will be too much maybe, but there are a number of problematic areas that accompany support for consensus as a viable polity. The first one is what consensus is stated in opposition to. If I'm clear there. What is consensus stated in opposition to? I've already referred to majoritarian democracy, but consensus is also stated in opposition to, very clearly by Kwasi Wiredu, a one-party state, which has been a political reality on the continent.
Exactly.
And people think that, not many, that some people think that the one-party systems could be seen as democratic in some ways. They do have some features which are similar to consensus. So they minus the nasty dictator, it could be democratic enough. The tragedy of a one-party state was that there was always a dictator hovering around. And
Exactly.
Now, if you look at that statement, that consensus now on the home ground, without any imposition from anybody, on the home ground, consensus is opposed to one-party systems. It's opposed to any attempt at imposing a political view on the people. I think that raises a lot of red flags. Why do I say that? If consensus did not have to worry about a one-party state, that would say quite a lot about consensus on credibility and standing. That consensus worries about it and feels the need to distance itself from it, and takes quite a few pages in its statement to prove that it is not like a one-party system. Yet some people who are not convinced by these pages that have been taken up to prove that it is not like a one-party system, and they still come back, sometimes with very good points, in an attempt to demonstrate that it is too close to a one-party system. It should cause us to worry. And I think we should pay sufficient attention to that kind of claim that's made against consensus, that its dissimilarity to a one-party system is negligible. Of course, sometimes it's put in a crass manner, but I think there is a worry there. Secondly, which is one of the chapters that I have here, how does consensus treat political parties? Kwasi Wiredu's title in probably his most famous paper is Democracy by Consensus, a plea for a non-party polity. A plea for a non-party polity. Consensus is committed to the idea of the eradication of political parties, because it sees political parties as vehicles of difference, which ultimately cause the kind of worries that we referred to right at the beginning of our discussion. Now, whether it is possible to conceive of a political system that does not subscribe to the presence of parties or not is another issue. One to be openly committed against parties, I think says a lot about that person and their commitment. Of course, Wiredu has got a neat explanation of how political interests can be retained and furthered in a non-party system, and I battle very hard against that interpretation in the book. Some people have said I'm not successful.
What have been their arguments?
Well, their arguments are that I have collapsed a certain technical distinction that's made by Wiredu. He's got a very funny, no, I withdraw the word funny. He's got a very unusual reference to the notion of party. He's got something that he calls party 1, party 2, party 3, and party 1-3. Party 1, so the 1 is a subscript.
Mm-hmm.
So he makes a distinction between party 1 and party 2 and party 3. Party 1 will be people just gathering together, having a certain political agenda. Party 2 may be a decisional moment. And then party 3 is actually the political party that's there. And party 1-3 is a combination of people with an agenda and the political organization. And this is the terrible stuff. Everybody in party 1 must move to party 2, which is a decisional moment. And I argue that party 1 and party 2 are not similar as a matter of conceptual analysis. Why? Because party 1 is a group of people, party 2 is a decisional moment, and party 3 is an actual organization. So when you combine party 1 and party 3, you have done some serious philosophical swindling there. What is the swindling? You have jumped to associate people with certain aspirations of a political nature, and you have put them in a proper political organization, and you've said suddenly they are evil because they skipped a decisional moment. But these were structures of real people, 1 and 3, and 2 is not conceptually equivalent to 1 and 3. So I find his combination of the subscripts 1-3 to give us a notion of a terrible idea of a party, which is in this case an oppositional party, a little bit slippery, but some people are not convinced by the argument I attempt there. However, for our purposes today, I simply say the very fact that consensus or the supporters of consensus readily buy into Wiredu's idea that democracy by consensus is committed to the non-existence of political parties in its polity must raise sufficient red flags. Then thirdly, which is consistent with what I've already said, I really worry about what consensual democracy can do, particularly looking at the station that Africa is currently at. Is consensus capable of developing Africa better than majoritarianism? Is consensus capable of securing a dignified existence for Africans better than majoritarianism or any other variant of democracy?
Exactly.
Or the real reason why we are pulling out consensus is the desire to satisfy some sense of recovery. What do I mean by this? We Africans know that colonialism disrupted a lot about us, yet we exist under the pressure to rediscover who we were before the arrival of colonialism.
Exactly, yeah, yeah.
And consensus could be one of those moments which have been described as a return to the source. Like the children of Israel, we have got to go back to the promised land. And there are many dangers that are attended to that attempt at going back to the promised land. And is consensus not just merely in the business of promising us that it is the quickest and most efficient way of getting back to the promised land?
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for that response, Professor Bernard. Democracy and consensus are very critical terms that you use oftenly in your book. How do you conceptualize them? How different and similar are they in political theory?
I think they are quite dissimilar. When they're combined, the one who does the combination must explicate what that combination entails and what its purpose is. Consensus is a standalone concept. Some people do believe that it falls under what is called deliberative theory. So some people think that when we're talking consensus, it must be understood that we are talking deliberative democracy. It could be a variant of deliberation. I know there are a few scholars who have taken that route, but I do not think that when one mentions the term democracy, it necessarily follows that what's immediately conjured up in people's minds is consensus. When one mentions the term democracy, it may lead to a variety of images that people may create for themselves, either based on their experiences or based on their aspirations or based on their thought processes about what democracy is. So I do not think it follows, or that it is obvious that the one term implies the other, or one term follows on the other. Those who may want to combine these two terms have got a lot of work to do to show us that consensus is actually democratic. I think it has been easily assumed that once it's stated, consensual democracy or democracy by consensus, or consensus is democracy, we will all have a clear understanding of what game is being played and what are the exact rules of that game. I do not think that the case is as easy as that. So my approach has been to attempt to understand consensus in terms of how it can be seen as living up to democratic requirements. That has been my approach in the book. It has not been the other way. Some people have attempted to say, how does a particular democratic system live up to the demands of consensus? I mean, there could be consensus between you and I on a number of issues that are of a non-political nature, about Arsenal's footballing capabilities, despite evidence to the contrary. But to assume rather easily that consensus, when combined with democracy, is easily spelled out and must be easily understood as such, was kind of a dissatisfying moment for me from my reading of the field. That's why I thought, let's measure consensus against what we may take to be conventional definitions of democracy. So I've got a whole chapter on what democracy is and what the purpose of democracy is. And I try to measure then consensus against what I consider to be the core of democracy. So conceptually, I think these two are not related. But a relationship can be created between the two, and whoever wants to create that relationship has got a lot of work to do to convince us that such a relationship is sustainable, according to the terms and definitions that they give us, of course.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for that. So from the studies that you have made, what would you say about the differences and similarities of consensual democracy and authoritarianism?
That is where the problem is, not so. As I've said, consensus says it is not going to be authoritarian. But here is a very interesting challenge that comes from the late philosopher, my favorite philosopher, Emmanuel Chukwudi. Emmanuel Chukwudi, in his direct challenge to Kwasi Wiredu, picks up on this interesting point that Wiredu raises about what made consensus possible amongst the Akans and traditional Akan society. Wiredu tells us that the political head was also the religious head. So the political head of the Akans was also their religious head. In modern terminology, we can imagine either the archbishop as president at the same time. Why? Because the political head was supposed to perform some religious functions on behalf of his community. In choosing this political head, therefore, it was absolutely necessary to investigate his moral uprightness so that he can be able to satisfy the requirements of the religious office. However, Emmanuel Eze challenges this account, and he says, since this religious head was also the political head and was responsible for both political and religious processes of his community, and under political processes, decisions were arrived at through consensus, where ordinary people who were participants in the political processes of consensus able to arrive at those decisions purely by virtue of rationality, as Wiredu claims, that central processes were rational in essence, or the religious factor kicked in and compelled people to see a certain form of reason over other forms of reason. Now, we can be very uncharitable and extend this argument and say, authoritarianism takes exactly the same shape. Any authoritarian regime has got a certain form of reason that it relies on.
Exactly.
What is it that makes people see that reason is preferable to alternative ways of reading and interpreting the situation? What makes people see that reason as persuasive is something else that has got absolutely nothing to do with that reason itself. There are other factors that compel people to accept what is presented to them as sufficient reason for theorization and practice. And this is where the crunch really occurs, I think. In my earlier work, I was not convinced that this was a strong objection, but now I am convinced that this is a strong objection. Why? Because if we look at the nature of political systems ground themselves on something. And that which political systems are grounded on matters quite a great deal. If there is a religious aspect, or in the case of consensus, forget religion for a moment, or in the case of consensus, there is a serious requirement that we must all be communitarian. We must be people who abide by dictates of a communitarian nature. If we are not communitarian, we are going to fail at consensus. Hence, the trouble starts there. Is consensus, now I may invoke Karl Popper, is consensus truly a representative of the open society? Or consensus qualifies as an enemy of the open society? Because there are some seriously limiting factors to consensus that may direct people in a particular way as opposed to some other way that they may choose. Of course, adherents and supporters of consensus will deny that and say consensus is not authoritarianism. And we do understand that it is not authoritarianism. But how far is it from authoritarianism, and how open is it? And how enabling is it, particularly for the kind of subjectivity that we think is consistent with democracy? Because you see, if we limit democracy to decision-making processes, decision-making is a game of manipulation, particularly at consensual levels. You could do some trade-offs. Today, I can go with you with the expectation that tomorrow you will go with me. Is that democratic? Maybe in a sense, but my worry is how open is consensus if we're going to take democracy as consistent with openness. Now, this is just another definition. Democracy is openness. Somebody may reject that definition, but that's the kind of worry that I have. I'm not prepared to say consensus is authoritarian, but what I'm prepared to say is that there are some things about consensus that are sufficiently worrying to take seriously those who claim that consensus retains features that are of an authoritarian nature.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Professor Bernard, the COVID-19 crisis has indicated how very easy it is for otherwise democratic institutions to impose autocratic methods to respond to the crisis. Is deliberative democracy a more effective way of dealing with a crisis than autocracy?
I think that's a very tricky question. it's a very hard question. I think personally what COVID-19 has done is to show the fault lines that were already there. You will know that before COVID-19 came around, which was at the beginning of this year really, if you look at 2019, what was making headlines? It was the rise of fascism in mature democracies, the rise of intolerance, the rise of the ill treatment of the foreigner, placing blame on the outsider. Democracy, or Western majoritarian democracy as we know it, has been in crisis for a very long time. Brexit is just one of those examples, and the fact that now in the news I hear that the United Kingdom is prepared to break whatever law is supposed to govern their exit from the EU is something that is close to a scandal. Exactly. Maybe not for those who are intent on breaking the law. The American system, Dawkins has been discussing this for quite a while. The American system has been in crisis. I mean, for good reference, Is Democracy Possible here is an excellent read. I think there have been lots of crises politically that relate to the status of democracy that have been besieging humanity for quite a while. And what COVID-19 did, I think, this is just speculation. What COVID-19 did was to show the fragility of systems that we thought were quite resilient. Today, that the United States of America, where you are, is unable to deal with COVID-19 tells us quite a lot about how fragile your society is. Even skewed your society is. You even look at who is dying, who is really getting sick from COVID-19. But I think no greater Christmas present could come early enough for wannabe dictators, wannabe autocrats, and wannabe controlling political authorities than COVID-19. I think anyone who has power, and I think it's naturally human, it will take saints, maybe, or angels. I think anyone who has power gets into power so that they can exert control.
Exactly.
And if a disease comes around and it gives you little leeway to exert control over your population, including an opportunity to crush your enemies or ideas that are opposed to your own, you maximize it.
Exactly.
But a disease like COVID-19 comes around, which enables you to lock up the whole country or whole cities. It's like leaving a small child in a candy shop unattended. The choice is yours, what you do with it. And we have lived through that moment, tragically. And we have occupied the front seat in witnessing how different leaders have reacted to COVID-19 and what they have done with COVID-19, either to cement their exercise of power or to be genuinely responsive to their citizens. And I do not pull this out of my thumb, but when I watch CNN, there have been discussions around how female presidents have done much better than their male counterparts in responding to COVID-19. Now, that is a topic for another day, but all I can say to you is I do think when a disease like this comes along with a capacity to provoke the use of power to the extent that we saw, it has got serious implications for our state of democracy. I mean, I have never lived under a curfew. This was the first time that I lived under a curfew, where I knew if I leave my house at this moment, and that is a curtailment of my movements. If I leave my house at this moment, I will be arrested. Comes upon me. And curfews are extreme measures. Sheltering in place is an extreme measure. Not, of course, from a health perspective, it's understandable, but also from a political point of view, many who desire to have power want to exercise power in the way that COVID-19 enabled them.
Excellent.
And we've seen it throughout the world.
Exactly. Wonderful. Thank you very much for that response. I can see politicians across the world now have every reason, every excuse to put in place any political measure that they want, either to thrash their political opponents or to push forward an agenda that favors their ideas. Well, Professor Bernard, thank you very much for joining me for this episode of The Conversation. This is the platform where I get to sit with established academics to have a 50 minutes, if not 55 minutes discussion of their outstanding publications for teaching and learning purposes. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful.